All right. Yeah, thank you, James. So I did want to take some time today and introduce the topic of turbulence modeling in Particleworks. This is a pretty big topic. It's something that you could go into a lot of depth, but this is going to be an introduction. So what am I going to share today? This is an introduction to turbulence modeling in Particleworks. So I have a introduction highlighted there or bolded. And that's because turbulence modeling is such a big topic. It's something you can go into a lot of detail. You can go into all the equations and really understand what's happening. But we're not going to get into all of that. We're just going to briefly cover the most important points to get you started. And I hope you come away from this inspired to learn more about turbulence modeling, how it can be applied to your simulations. You're not going to get everything from this one presentation, and I hope that you'll take the time to learn more about it. And so I do have these things here. There's a lot of new equations. When you're looking at turbulence modeling, there's a lot of new parameters that can be set. It can be a little bit overwhelming at first, and I want to help you get started with turbulence modeling. And so we're just going to jump straight into it. So Particleworks uses a hybrid LES approach, and that LES is large eddy simulation. And so specifically, Particleworks uses a Smagorinsky model with some modifications for wall effects. And if those words don't mean much to you, if you haven't done much turbulence modeling before, don't worry too much about it. We're going to try to help you get started. So these techniques aren't unique to Particleworks. These are techniques that are used in many CFD codes. And I want to help you introduce LES, help you get started, help you understand some of the basics. But if you are familiar with LES already, you may find some of this already pretty familiar. And so I have this quote here. Back when I was in grad school, I took a turbulence class, and this is the textbook that we used during this class. Turbulence was probably the hardest class that I ever took. Had a lot of difficult equations, a lot of difficult numerical methods to understand in order to get good answers. But it was a valuable class for me. There's a lot to learn, and it's a very big topic. And so this quote, I'll go ahead and read that. So large eddy simulation, LES, occupies a middle ground between RANS and DNS, DNS there being direct numerical simulation. And in this, the idea is to compute the dynamics of as much of the large energy containing scales of motion as is economically feasible, while modeling only the effects of small, unresolved phenomena in the larger resolved scales. And so that's have the reference for the textbook there too. So I wanted to summarize that a little bit, and I have these 3 points here. The third one largely being a resummary of the first two. So first, these large eddies are going to be calculated and will be visible in your simulations. But all of the eddies won't be able to be resolved. There's some limitations due to the particle size. So second here, small eddies cannot be resolved because the particle size will limit the size of the eddies that can be resolved. And so then third, partially a resummary of those first 2 points. We modeled the large eddies directly, the small eddies by accounting for their effects on the rest of the flow. And that is done using an eddy viscosity. And so an eddy viscosity is essentially you're adding in some extra viscosity into your calculation, and you do that in order to account for all these effects at these smaller scales from these smaller eddies. And that ends up being a more accurate representation of what's happening at some of these smaller scales. All right, so perhaps the most important question that you have to figure out to get started is, when do you actually need to include turbulence modeling? And so these effects are going to be largest at high velocities and more specifically, a high Reynolds number. And the effects are also going to be largest when you have a large particle size. So if you think back to the previous slide, we're saying that um, the effects that are able to be resolved from the particle size are going to be included in the simulation. But anything smaller than that will have to be resolved using this turbulence modeling. And so if the particle size is too large to capture the physics of what you're trying to look at, then turning on the turbulence modeling will have a bigger effect. And so this is a trade-off that you're going to have to take a look at. The big trade-off here is that the turbulence modeling significantly increases the simulation time. And uh, and so often you're taking a look at your simulation and you're trying to decide, is the most effective use of simulation time to reduce the particle size, or is it to turn on the turbulence modeling? And both of those can have significant differences in the accuracy of your simulations. And so sometimes you're making that trade-off in trying to decide what is the most effective use of my simulation time. And a lot of that is determined through experience. You have to play around with this a little bit and understand what the effects actually are. And so I encourage you to play around with it. All right, so I do have this simple example. When you're taking a look at this example, you'll notice that it is a pretty coarse particle size. We have these fairly large particles, and if you're thinking back to what I've just talked about, the effect is larger when you have a coarse particle size. And so in this example, the difference is pretty large, actually. And so with the turbulence modeling turned off on the left compared to turned on the right, you have significantly more fluid being carried around by that rotating gear. And we have some backup for that statement on this next slide. So we have a graph here. So we took a box, and within this box, we're measuring the number of particles. And because that's a region kind of suspended in air, that's an interesting area where there's a significant difference between these two simulations. And we can see that with the turbulence modeling turned on, we have this graph in red that's significantly more particles in that region than with the turbulence modeling turned off. And you'll notice that if you try this with different simulations, the effects will be different. It is largely dependent on the particle size, and it's also largely dependent upon the speed of your simulations, how fast a gear is rotating, how fast the fluid is moving within your simulation. All right, so what does this actually look like in Particleworks? In Particleworks, the turbulence modeling is turned on in the MPS section. And if you change the type there to turbulence, then you're going to get a whole new list of parameters that you have the capability of changing. A full description of these parameters is something that I'll have to leave to a more detailed something in which I have more time to describe these. But for now, what I want to say about these values is that largely you won't need to change them. And I encourage you not to change them until you have an understanding of what each of those parameters does. So if you're just starting out, if you're just trying to see if turbulence modeling would be effective for your simulation, I encourage you to try it without changing any of the parameters, leaving everything as is, and letting that simulation run like that. Now, I'm going to give a brief description of how Particleworks thinks about that and what these parameters does. But again, much of it will be left to some future presentations, some future questions. If you would like more information, please follow up and I'd be happy to provide more information. For the purposes of this, I'll give a brief introduction to what these parameters do. So a simple way of looking at how Particleworks uses the turbulence modeling is this following three-step process. So the first step here is to calculate a y plus. So a y plus is essentially a non-dimensionalized version of a distance. And it's a distance from a wall, but it also includes some information about the strain, and I believe it also, yes, it also believe it includes a viscosity. So it's a non-dimensionalized version, which means that it can apply to multiple scales and any fluid, multiple viscosities. But the first thing that has to happen in Particleworks is it has to determine how close it's going to be to a wall to determine whether or not it wants to take into effect these wall effects and some of the interesting effects that happen close to the wall. And if you're too close to the wall, then it's going to assume it's in a viscous sublayer. And then if you're in the next region, there's going to be some wall effects. And then finally, there's going to be a region in which it's far away from the wall, and you're no longer going to take those wall effects into account. And so you start out calculating that y plus. You define the turbulence model based upon the y plus, and the boundary parameters are what determine what region you're going to be in. And finally, you calculate the eddy viscosity using some equations which aren't listed here. And so you calculate that eddy viscosity. That eddy viscosity is then added to the kinematic viscosity in the fluid properties. Now, this is a fairly expensive calculation for Particleworks to carry out, and as a result of that, it does significantly increase the simulation time, but it is fairly valuable in certain applications. So my approach when I'm starting out with turbulence modeling in a new model, there are new outputs that you're able to include in your simulation when you're including the turbulence modeling. So one of these outputs is the y plus. In addition, you can have the kinematic and eddy viscosity. So these are values that you can add into your color map onto the particles. You can see what the y plus is for each particle, and you can see what the eddy viscosity is for each of those particles based upon the calculations that are happening beneath the surface. So those are outputs that are directly available that can be mapped onto the particles. In addition to that, what you'll want to pay attention, two additional things that you'll want to pay attention to. First is the difference in simulation time. You're going to notice an increase in the simulation time, and you'll want to keep track of how much that simulation time is increasing. And another thing that you'll want to keep track of is the time step. So there is a calculation that happens in Particleworks in which if the viscosity raises too much, this viscosity, which can be raised because of the eddy viscosity, if the viscosity raises too much, then it will drop the time step as a result of that. And so you will want to keep track of that, see if the time step is changing. This is a potential area where the simulation can actually break down, and you'll end up having errors, and you'll end up having simulations that will just never finish if you allow them to continue. So you will want to keep track of what the time step's doing when you include the turbulence modeling. Just to summarize real briefly, I encourage you to learn as much about this as possible. There's a lot of detail that we could go into here. I recommend using the Particleworks theory manual to understand this topic. The theory manual is included with installations of Particleworks. But in addition to that, there's many sources, textbooks, YouTube lectures, which talk about this subject because it really isn't specific to Particleworks. If you're looking at the keywords, you'll want to look for large eddy simulation, LES, Smagorinsky model, detached eddy simulation, DES. And so, um, and we'd also like to hear from you if you'd like to learn more about turbulence and Particleworks. Um, so yeah, it's absolutely possible to get better simulation results using turbulence model, but you'll want to be careful because you will have longer simulation times. It's an additional way in which you can come across errors, and you'll want to be careful about how you'd apply that if you're actually improving the amount of information you're getting for the time that you're taking by including the turbulence model. So with that, I'd like to thank you. Please leave questions if you have any. And with that, I'll turn the time over to our next presentation.